You're listening to From Embers, a podcast about anarchist ideas and practice across so-called Canada, and a member of the Channel Zero Anarchist Podcast Network. Today you're going to be hearing a conversation between my co-host and two anarchists from Southern Ontario about a workshop they developed called The Coming Climate Catastrophe. A version of that workshop was also recently published as an article on North Shore Counterinfo, which we'll link to in our show notes. In this interview, you'll hear about how this workshop came about, its relationship to an anonymous anarchist text from 2011 called Desert, how Southern Ontario might look in 25 years or so, how their take differs from our 2021 interview with Aric McBay, and why you don't need to be a climate scientist to do this kind of research and apply it to your own bioregion. We started off by asking them to introduce the workshop.
We decided to put together a pretty in-depth workshop on climate change and what we can expect the material and geological effects of climate change to be in our part of the world in the coming years. It kind of emerged out of a discussion group and a reading group that we've been doing with some comrades here. I had been having a conversation with a friend of mine who I will not do them dirty and list their name, but we were out and they were basically just telling me one day about how they were skeptical that we were going to meet the target set under the Paris Agreement, and I was like, "Are you kidding? Like, like what about the way that we're living makes you think that that's even a remote possibility?" And then I asked if they'd read Desert, and they hadn't, and I was like, "Oh my God." So we did we started with a reading group of Desert, and we did a couple of other things, and sort of this project, this specific workshop, kind of grew out of that, and us wanting to kind of do a bit of a deep dive on what climate change is actually going to look like, based on kind of what our best guess is on based on like the science and what trajectory we're on currently.
Yeah. I'd add for me, so there were three of us initially that had given the workshop. There's just the two of us today. The other person and myself, we sat down, and I guess the tone of the conversation was, I want to talk about the future, and to some degree I want to do the future with you, and that kind of led, this was like over a year ago, and that kind of led to this background interest in maybe like skill building, but even then before we start skill building, like we need to know things, like we want to know actually like what we're looking at. And it became clear that knowledge about climate change, knowledge about the world was like a kind of grab bag of global catastrophe and or like worst case scenarios or very obscure bits of information, and it's like not just kind of get it clear on what does climate change could actually look like, but also what is it going to look like here specifically, as opposed to where's it going to look like in like the global south or on a different continent or something, like where in this region, which specifically is Southern Ontario.
And the only thing I guess I will add is that it started out, the first time that we did it, it was about like 4.5 hours. Then we condensed it down to a slightly more manageable 3-hour workshop, and then we recently did it at the Hamilton Anarchist Book Fair, and it was 2 hours there. But every time it's been it's quite a downer.
You mentioned the text Desert. I assumed that was important for you guys. That's a pretty old text at this point. For our listeners, can one of you just quickly explain what that is? You don't have to summarize the entire text, obviously.
Sure. And it is something that is a bit dated now, but at the time it was it really made a lot of waves because it was really the first that kind of took as the central premise that we weren't going to stop climate change. There's a lot of rhetoric around discussions of climate change about, we only have 1 more year or 5 more years, and it seems like there's been the same rhetoric for decades now. And so I think Desert took from its starting premise that we're not going to start climate change or stop climate change. And so what does that mean? And what sort of opportunities and challenges are anarchists going to face if we accept that there is going to be drastic changes to our climate and weather patterns and stuff like that. And so, it kind of, in a lot of, in some circles, it's sort of seen as like the counterpoint to like the bread book amongst like green anarchists. There was a big campaign to try to encourage people to read Desert. I think there was like a website that's like readdesert.com or something like that. I don't know if it's still up, but it's a classic text. And yeah, I mean, some of the science is a bit dated, but the central premise is still one that I think that's important for people to get their head around.
So you're talking about sort of climate-wise, geographically, like what will the world look like in the future? This is pretty regionally specific stuff. What region did you choose to focus on, and why?
We chose our home region, like in Southern Ontario, kind of like closer to, we're talking like Toronto, GTA, Guelph, like down towards London, up towards Kingston. Like that whole area is going to be affected pretty similarly. The goal of first choosing that was actually to bring our friends a presentation, a profile of what our future could look like, as a contribution to how we're going to think about like dealing with that together. Actually, like we're kind of, the workshop covers a roughly 25-year span. And it's not like a timeline so much as we try to keep our projections and our predictions and our speculations by 2050 or around 2050. The second half of this century looks very different and also very unknowable in a lot of ways. We try to keep it more tangible. Also, again, because we're sitting down with a group of adults who are like in their 20s, 30s, or 40s or something, like the next 25 years are going to be some of the most active of like us in our social worlds. And we wanted to keep it like really grounded and useful.
And yeah, so a lot of it is very specific to this region, but with a question like climate change, obviously there is broader implications, and so the first half of the workshop deals with more kind of local geological factors, and then the second one sort of starts to get into some of the political implications that sort of emerge from those facts.
And in terms of those local geological features, you're obviously not going to rehash your entire workshop, but what are some of the changes that people living in Southern Ontario should expect to see in those 25 years? Like, what are some of the things that really stick out about that?
To 3 categories in terms of like just sort of bare bones climate predictions. We talked about like seasonality and temperature and weather patterns, and like the most obvious of the climate related elements of the region. And then we talked about water use, fresh water, its movement, precipitation. We also talked about biodiversity. These were like, again, stemmed by questions that we had, and then the answers we got were, I mean, some more drastic than others. I think we found some surprises, and we also like found some stuff that feels pretty predictable. For example, like the seasonal temperature changes, and like the way that the summer gets hotter and the winter gets warmer and the winter gets shorter. These things feel, I would say, pretty intuitive. People can expect on average throughout the year like 2-degree increase through most of the seasons, and winter's going to get shorter, and that's going to pose a lot of problems for cycles of life that revolve around frost. And our precipitation patterns are going to continue to change the way that we've noticed the past couple of years, specifically with like these really big downpours. Otherwise there's stretches of very little precipitation, and it feels like a lot of micro droughts, or sometimes very much larger droughts throughout the year, and then these huge like deluges.
And then we branched out from there, and we covered some of the things that are a little bit broader that we wanted to dig into a little bit more. So we looked at like industry, energy, and extraction, and sort of like how these are going to be changing in the coming years. Looking at agriculture, again, regionally, and then some of the sort of broader surrounding regions. Then looking at population and migration, which is going to be a major factor. And then also just some of the political climate here, and kind of drawing in from implications from a bunch of the other stuff. That was sort of how we wrapped it up. We also talked, I think, a little bit about like infrastructure and supply chains, and there may have been a couple of other minor points that we covered in like the first sort of big workshop that we did that was like 4.5 hours, like the mega workshop. But yeah, and then I mean, in terms of what it's going to look like, each of these we in and of themselves show like a part of the picture, and it's really actually when you look at all of the picture combined that you start to actually really get an understanding of what the more existential threats to human civilization are. It was about at the 3-hour mark or something of the first workshop where I was really like, oh yeah, like we are doomed. Like sometimes people I think have this idea of climate change as kind of like a vague dread of things are going to get really bad, or maybe people associate it with like far off images of rising sea levels wiping out coastal cities and stuff like that. This was I think a way of actually wrapping our heads around how each of these different kind of issues, which are actually going to experience their own sort of crises, and then how those overlap and kind of feed into one another, and to create like a much bigger crisis that we're it becomes uncertain or very clear that like things could not continue as they currently are under this sort of framework, or under this sort of strain, I guess. We can go into some of those individually if you want, but yeah, I mean, again, like we said, I mean, it's a pretty deep dive. So I mean, there was a bunch of stuff that we found very surprising and interesting when we were looking at things. Like local biodiversity was a big one. Basically, that the area that we live in Southern Ontario is like the most biodiverse region in all of Canada, and has been and continues to be, even though it is also the most developed, and it has seen the most loss of nature and biodiversity. It still is, despite all that, the area with the most biodiversity, and that's going to continue. Also just looking at the fact that like the area known colloquially as like the Greenbelt in Ontario, there's like a region, there's like an agricultural region that is like around some of the major population centers. There's been a whole bunch of debate and news about this, because it's kind of a perpetual issue where there's developers who are trying to gain access to it, and there's a lot of like pretty popular campaigns against development on the Greenbelt. There was a big scandal with the provincial government where it emerged that the premier's cabinet ministers were making deals with developers at like a wedding in Las Vegas over drinks and stuff like that. So looking at it in terms of kind of mapping like where population growth is happening, and then also just about how incredibly important like the Greenbelt is for the purpose of agriculture. It's like the most it's the best farmland in all of Canada as well. But our conclusions were basically that given population growth, it's kind of inevitable that we're going to lose the Greenbelt to human development. And what does that kind of mean in terms of the overall agricultural prospects of the country, and of the surrounding region? Because once you get into a further down the timeline, the borders start to actually become less important as well. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think a lot of people don't quite realize exactly how much food is actually still grown in Southern Ontario. I wonder if you could maybe, without doing like the full deep dive, each give me kind of something like that. Like, what is, I think a lot of people are like, oh, climate change, yeah, it's going to get hotter. There will be like some flooding in some regions. But for you personally, like, what was something that was really striking about how people's lives and the world would change here in Southern Ontario, that you like didn't expect to find?
Just building off what you were saying, most people don't realize how much food is grown here, and then coupling that with thinking about what happens like elsewhere in the continent, the amount of pressure that we're going to experience in Ontario, or Southern Ontario specifically, to grow more food than we even do is going to increase at the same time like we're losing access to this agricultural land. At the same time, the skills and like the sort of industry that makes up that food growing capacity is mostly like modern enslavement and migrant workers. And these things, like when just looking at agriculture in Southern Ontario specifically, like these three kind of factors are crescendoing at the same time, and that paints a pretty big bleak picture all on its own. Like losing some of the best soil to suburbs is like a pretty bleak prospect when all of a sudden it becomes, we're going to see like a new wave of like a need for agriculture here, you know? And this also couples with the biodiversity talk. Like, this bioregion being the most diverse in the country, it's lost to residents, to roads, to agriculture, to industry. It's lost about like 90% of that biodiversity, and it's still the most biodiverse. The thing that could threaten this, right, is this competition between needing to grow food and needing to house more and more people. And we found that climate change, the changing temperatures, the changing seasons, the changing weather, isn't really a driver of biodiversity loss here the way it would be in lots of other places in the world. Those two are often linked kind of on like a scientific or like geological level, but here it looks like it's going to be mostly human development that causes that problem. Okay, and then working backwards a little bit, seasonal temperatures. I mentioned that it's going to get hotter. Like what that means for us, you know, GTA, Kingston, Guelph area. Guelph specifically, I think, is going to get quite hot, but it means more heat waves, actually. It just means longer heat waves. It means they're going to be more frequent. It means more taxing on the energy grid, more stressful on like vulnerable populations, elders, people with like medical conditions to consider. Generally cities become like harder to live in that way. It also means that the winters get warmer, and in kind of the same way that like more air conditioning puts pressure on the energy system, like actually not having to heat the homes as much like relieves a bit of pressure. It makes the growing season a bit longer. And I was surprised by some of the counterintuitive effects, and I think maybe on a government level some of the countries in the global north know this. Like there are some pretty limited effects that climate change will have on the global north, here included, that in some ways makes it more what they would call habitable, but I guess we would reframe as like economically viable. Again, like a longer growing season and like a warmer residential area are good things for like a city when you're doing like massive urban planning.
I think that the main takeaway, or one of the main takeaways from the workshop, is that we're incredibly lucky to be living in this part of the world compared to, we're living in essentially, I think that we came to the determination that this is likely one of, if not the best place to be living in the world in terms of like from purely what the effects of climate change themselves will be. But then you know, you have to layer on top of that, what does that actually sort of mean? And what other kinds of pressures is that going to put on us if you know, we're living in a world where there's massive migration happening on a scale that is like completely unlike anything we've ever seen. I mean, I think that like that's kind of where a lot of the sort of the additional kind of pressures come from, is from like, you know, the what we see as like a giant rush of people to kind of to populate this region, and even also just parts of a little bit north of here. You know, Canada and like particularly Ontario, I think is going to be a recipient region for like migration. So the concerns that we'll have to deal with here are very different from what they will be in places around like the Mediterranean or around the equator and stuff like that. Which, I mean, maybe we can get into some of those, what some of those pressures are a little bit more detail, but that was sort of one of the main takeaways, I think. In terms of the actual temperature, it's going to be, I think that the prediction is that by, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's the prediction was around like 2070. We were looking at where this region is going to have like a similar climate to like parts of Kentucky. So, not the worst. But yeah, the other factors are going to be what really we have to worry about.
Yeah, just before we get into that obvious like social implication piece, do you mind just spelling out like sort of ecologically why that is? Like, is it because we're not near an ocean? Is it because it's already kind of cold here? Like, what are the differences between this region and others that make that true?
Before I give a stab at answering your question, we didn't really put this at the very beginning. We are neither like experts nor scientists, obviously, but even that, like this was a couple weeks or I guess a couple months of research put into like a pretty condensed like presentation. So I'm going to answer your question in like a very oversimplified way, probably, because I don't fully know, I guess, the mechanics as to like why globally some places are going to be affected more than others. Water comes to mind as like a really big one. And for a couple different ways, like for example, having a large body of water close to you can moderate the temperature. And our water table, the freshwater table, like the Great Lakes effectively, are large enough and well sourced enough that there isn't much concern about the amount of water here going down. When we talk about climate change globally, that's up there like top 3 concerns of like loss of water. Even like California's like stressing, and Arizona's already like kind of a sham in terms of like a place to live, given how all their water already comes from somewhere else. And that's going to change for those people. And I don't know. It seems like that's not going to change for us in a way. And this is going to be a place of abundant fresh water. And in terms of like temperature, why it's not going to get overly hot here, it's kind of a mix of our latitude and our place in the jet stream. Like we just have, I guess, an ecology that's going to moderate itself pretty well, and like weather patterns pretty well. We're far enough inland that you mentioned that we're not seeing sea level rise. We're not seeing big storms the way that the coasts will. I think we're going to see more ice storms, more tornadoes, more like small scale storms, that like cause a lot of power outages and damage homes and can fuck up crops and stuff, but nothing like city destroying. So there's a lot of ecological and geological resources here that stabilize the region kind of all on its own, and we just happen to be here. And we're alluding to this concept of like a climate haven, and there are other potential climate havens in the world. That's even kind of a speculative term on its own. It's pretty loaded already. And of all the climate havens that are like large, there's parts of Siberia, New Zealand, the Pacific Northwest, maybe like the highlands in South America. These are areas that are expected to, again, get slightly warmer, maybe get access to a bit more water, maybe just become more habitable, again, from like an economic or state management of population standpoint. And of all those climate havens, this one is very large. Like there's a lot of space. This one has access to so much fresh water that wouldn't be a problem. And it's inside the territory of an already existing like so-called stable democratic nation. So between the capacity to house more people and the resources to do so, it makes it a very like appealing place to be. Yeah.
This is obviously getting into speculation at this point, but what are some of the potential social impacts and political impacts of that many people wanting to move to this region in the next quarter of a century?
Yeah, I guess maybe I'll before we get into like what that means for us here, I'll talk a little bit about like migration globally as well as continentally and then locally. There's gonna be a lot of different like things that are pushing people around. And yeah, I was like reading like a figure earlier today or something. The estimate is like 1 billion climate migrants by 2050, and that's globally. Most of those are around the global south, and a lot of that migration is going to be domestically in other places. This doesn't necessarily mean 8 billion humans are going to now seek refuge here. I think migration and economic turmoil and like resource pressure and supply chain pressure elsewhere does sort of have like second order effects of wanting people to come here. And to illustrate this need for migration, one thing that was really surprising for me that came up and reinforced this idea of climate havens in my head was what's called like a wet bulb heat wave. Maybe some people will have read the opening of Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future. It has a very like devastating introduction of a heat wave. And this is something that has been researched. I think like just this year, the University of Ottawa put out some research on it as well. Large amounts of the planet, large amounts of the very, very densely populated parts of the planet are going to experience very different, like a climate change very different than what we're going to experience here. The temperature increases are going to be very severe. The humidity increases are going to be very severe. And this combination specifically of humidity and temperature increase results in like an atmospheric condition, just like the air around your body being so hot and so humid that you can't sweat, you can't perspire. This shuts down the body's ability to regulate its heat, and a healthy adult has, you know, in like 35 degrees Celsius with 100% humidity, has roughly like 6 hours to live maybe. And yeah, there are places in the world, again, that are very habitable, habited by millions and millions of people that are looking at a climate change that could introduce heat waves like that, like on a yearly basis, or if not more.
One of the slides that really dramatically illustrated the problem, you know, the global civilization is going to face. There was a slide that shows where there is like the highest rate of population growth currently. And then there was the next slide was basically a map where the heat bulb effect is expected to be most pronounced by 2050. And they were almost like a direct corollary. And so you have places like India is going to be largely uninhabitable, or you know, at least to the point where, you know, there are incredibly fatal heat waves every year that kill children and old people. Like, you're basically going to have this like around an area of the world, like large parts of West Africa, around like Central America, and you know, the parts of like the Mediterranean, or all around the Mediterranean rather, the Caribbean, places where, you know, currently 2 billion people live. They're going to be, or areas that are not particularly habitable for human life. And so what does that kind of pressure do on, you know, the global political, socioeconomic institutions and frameworks like for society that we have right now? It's kind of a shock to the global system that, you know, is historically unprecedented. But that is basically, that is going to be the main driver of migration by, again, 2050, which is not that far from here, right? Like, that's when a lot of these projections we're looking at.
Yeah, to talk about like whole swaths of the global south as like uninhabitable, that's like a really worst case scenario that's by 2050, you know, although by 2100, does that seem like almost certain? That's like harder to speculate on, even from a scientific perspective, but it's on the table. And again, we'll get back to that later. But even if between now and then there's like 4 heat waves, you know, that render that air, like large areas uninhabitable for a week or something, the notion, the desirability of wanting to be there, the feasibility of having like a family, that changes enough. Like the idea and the fear and the real threat of it is enough to cause migration all on its own, never mind the fact that the area actually becomes. And we're not also talking about like all of India, we're talking about like a lot of coastal regions, we're talking about a lot of like little pockets throughout these places, just so happens where a lot of the big cities are. Knowledge about the States, the United States of America, this nation state neighbor of ours, there's a large, like, I don't know, it looked like 30% of the southern half of the country, 30% in the south of the country of the entire thing, kind of destined to become far less suitable for humans to live as well, due to heat waves like this, due to drought, due to like infrastructure that can't handle that many people in such an inhospitable place, and then never mind like American sensibilities for comfort and their like desire to live somewhere that's like, pleasant, and sort of cushy. This puts a lot of like migration pressure over the next 25 years even here on Turtle Island. Like, this means that when governments and individuals are looking at places to put themselves and their populations, like, around the Great Lakes becomes again like the primary place to be. It has the most water, it has the most moderate climate projections, it has a lot of space right now, it has a lot of infrastructure to build more infrastructure. Like, everything about it seems really ideal.
I mean, the way that this was sort of presented in the workshop was that there may be upwards of like 100 million climate migrants, like, within the United States, coming from the west and the south up towards like the northeast. And we intentionally didn't really spend a lot of time in our workshops talking about war and how genocide and all the other like horrible atrocities that the ruling class may avail themselves to when faced with the same sort of data that we're looking at. But in this case, it was something that was pretty unavoidable to look at. Like, all of these people that are coming from the U.S. I mean, there's obviously going to be all sorts of political and like violence like that actually accompanies this migration within the U.S. But there's also just no reason to think that the border is actually going to be to stop them. I mean, like, Canada and the U.S. obviously has like the longest and most porous border in the world, and as like whatever happens in the U.S. We didn't really speculate on it once you start to get into all the sort of dystopian kind of scenarios about what like a state collapse in the U.S. could conjure up. But we did look at like what are the implications of a bunch of these Americans coming over to like the region where the remaining majority of the remaining fresh water in the world is, right?
The nice version sounds like silent annexation and or absorption, and then every version that we could think of after that probably involves everything from like an imperialist fascist government to just a horde of very heavily armed individuals sort of just like taking the things that they need,
Christian ISIS coming over from Michigan.
It creates a whole different political relationship, which obviously we've already started to see in like this weird bit of trade war rhetoric that's come up this year. But this for reasons that haven't even been talked about in like the mainstream media or something by Carney and Trump or whatever. Like, these guys will be old news by then, but the pressure will still exist, the tension will still exist.
Obviously there's lots to talk about in terms of like the pretty horrifying things that states could do in the event of that many migrants seeking to come here and to the northern US. But like, even in a utopian sense, like, imagine in a stateless society, say, like, ecologically, like, physically, how many migrants could the region support? Like, how much of the world could be saved by migration to this area, Like, there must be some ecological limit there as well.
Well, I mean, I think that really depends on how people live, right? We didn't delve into this too much, but I mean, the obvious answer to me is, I mean, you can have a certain number of people living with our current ecological footprint, or you can have a lot more people with a better ecological footprint. You sort of, I think, preface it correctly by just talking about this being like a utopian sort of way of viewing it anyways, because like, honestly, I mean, yeah, none of these things are gonna occur under ideal situations. I don't think we're too close. Like, we're sort of on the precipice of this future. So the type of social transformation that would occur to get us to a place where we could live in a more sustainable way is kind of like, that runway is very rapidly like disappearing.
Yeah, when we were giving this presentation, I remember also thinking about these numbers, people moving, this question you asked, like, how many people could be here supported by this area? And then I was also thinking about those figures that we were talking about with biodiversity earlier, like 90% of this area has already been lost in terms of biodiversity, and that remaining 10% is still super valuable. and we currently have every intention of paving over most of it with suburbs. And yeah, booster juice.
Okay. And then you said you didn't want to talk about like war or genocide or any of these things. What political implications did you talk about in the workshop?
So I think that we did talk about the migration of people from the United States as being a fairly inevitable thing, and that was kind of near the end of the workshop. We did also preface it by saying, we're not going to be discussing things like nuclear war or whatever that could completely alter, what like the data and like a lot of the factors that we're talking about, right? Obviously, it could just be the end of everything. So we didn't want to go off on like what could be a long like speculative path towards like what ifs. But yeah, we did talk about the high likelihood of migration coming over from the U.S. We did talk about some of the conclusions that as anarchists that we draw from this, but again, it was not we didn't really offer any solutions, and I think that was a criticism that one of the participants received at the Hamilton Book Fair when we did it there was I was looking for like how anarchism was going to solve this problem, and our comrade who we presented it with was like, well, we never said that we never promised that, and I mean there is no anarchism's not going to save or prevent this from happening, right? It's not really within our capability to do so, but there are implications that anarchists can take from this, and some of those were basically that we do have some time to start actually preparing for this, and I think that as the text desert that kind of kicked off this reading group made clear, the time has really sort of come, and I mean this was written 10 years ago, but the time has really come to sort of decouple ourselves from sort of the activist culture and mainstream environmentalism that is kind of just looking towards states to come up with like solutions to this, to limit our carbon emissions or whatever, in some hopes of like offsetting this future that is like already pretty baked in at this point. So really, I mean, what we want is for people to come up with like and start planning, like what does this actually mean? And we didn't want to tell people what to do. We made a point of being like, some people are going to want to stay in cities, and and those people should, and other people might want to go out and start some land projects and find like some areas where they can actually defend land from whatever forces are going to be encroaching on them in the future, if there's roving kind of militias from northern Michigan or whatever. Those are and essentially, I mean, like, without trying to go full prepper, we did want to point out that now is if you're going to be starting to make these plans, like, it's going to be a lot easier to do that now than it will be in like 10-15 years from now. So people should start at least thinking about what they want to do, and what are these implications kind of mean for them.
I guess it's twofold. On one side, there's this sort of like banquet of all the other problems and crises that we can often imagine existing here as well, like supply chain issues, food issues, economic issues like recessions, energy shortages, blackouts, etc. We talk about like pandemics and how both ecologically and socially the conditions for pandemics increase. There's a much longer list of other crises to choose from when everything is aggravated by climate, which is one of the main things that we wanted to talk about, which is that this is an unignorable force, an unignorable contribution to the future of the landscape of decisions we have to make. And then on the other hand, we talked about I guess mostly this impacted like industry and extraction, but the trend right now feels very in line with what makes sense will continue, which is like this nationalist, colonial, extractivist tendency here in Canada. For that to pick up, for that to get harsher, for that to get like more unrelenting, for that to become more and more favorable actually to people in a really fucked up way. You know, as Canada seeks to like uncouple itself from the U.S., it digs itself a deeper and deeper hole, and more tension around extractivism.
Yeah, one of the things that we haven't really talked about now, but which was a component of the workshop as well, was just sort of looking at IPCC's zero emission scenario and kind of like the push that already exists towards renewable and green energy, and about how that will play out here. So this would be an incentive to kind of further colonize Northern Ontario, and you know, this was something that was already obviously in the works with the Ring of Fire development and stuff like that. And I mean, since we first gave the workshop, there's only been more action taken or more steps taken in this direction. So I think, like, you know, that's not a big geopolitical consideration, but in terms of kind of the way that things will play out in Ontario, we could see the further settlement and kind of urbanization of areas in Northern Ontario that are currently just parts of the boreal forest.
I heard from some people who went to your workshop that the three of you were just totally unwilling to tell anyone like what they should or shouldn't do in terms of anarchist organizing or like the right projects to throw ourselves into given this reality. So I'm not going to ask you about that exactly. But I did kind of want to ask about like the general like emphasis or affect. I interviewed Aric McBay a few years back about like some older but similarly gloomy climate projections. And similarly, we kind of talked about the research and like what might the world look like and like what's the really bad news. But at the end, like his take home, when asked whether we should sort of just start talking about ways to like mitigate or live within that reality rather than stop it, was that it's like deeply unethical to do that, basically. That we can't possibly, there's no way politically or even ecologically that we could accept the number of migrants that we would need to accept in that context, and that basically like to give up on the climate movement is to like accept mass death, which we must not do. I wonder if you can speak to that a little bit about the choice to go there, like the choice to talk about all these things as if they are just happening, rather than because I think Aric's point wasn't like, yeah, we can totally still just like stop climate change. It was like, rather than that, it was like, well, like every reduction in carbon emissions that does happen, which he thinks mostly comes from like anti-colonial movements, not the mainstream climate movement, is like lives saved. Like if it takes longer for a specific city to flood, if it gets slightly less hot in a specific place, as a result of those movements that are like naming themselves as efforts to stop climate change, that is like that is worthwhile, and that is like the most ethical place to put our energy given this reality. Obviously I feel like you're referencing desert, you're talking about people basically accepting and thinking of ways to instead live within a reality where the world would be like much less habitable as a whole. How do you defend that? Like, what do you say to that, basically, that you're just letting a bunch of mass death kind of slide?
Yeah, I just listened to that episode actually, and I could tell there was like I wouldn't say a dissonance between sort of Aric's like insistence and sort of like commitment to having a sort of like positive spin, or trying to have a very positive spin, and that being the point of like trying to keep like hopeful and focused. And yeah, social movements leading to small gains in mitigation of the effects of climate change, I wouldn't comment on strategically. Like I would never, yeah, it seems true to me. I think he described it as like the most bang for your buck, and that, yeah, I don't know that I would argue with that. I think that is probably a worthwhile thing to do. And this is maybe why at the end of our presentation we were like refusing to give concrete, we think this. I guess you kind of said it there. Instead of solving this, mitigating or living with it, I think the three of us at least, when looking at this data, and then looking at the situation like politically, geopolitically, industrially, it feels like, yeah, solving it, that's like old news. No one's kind of even like the most mainstream, climate scientists and politicians are like not on team we're going to solve climate change and like remove its effects and avoid it. I think now the mainstream discourse is on mitigation. I think we're moving on to live with it. And then how do we accept mass death? How do we accept disaster? I mean, ethically, I personally have like struggled a lot with that question before this presentation, and then much more so after. We watched a film recently called Revolution or Death that some media put out, and maybe we'll talk a bit about it later if it feels relevant. But in the discussion afterwards, so a similar group that was part of our reading group that led to this workshop was having a discussion after that film, and just a little snag or like a little kind of like turn of phrase that we stumbled upon was, we felt like the name was a misnomer only in that it sounds like revolution and death is the much more like realistic, if much more bleak, outlook to have. And again, to get to this ethically, I feel torn about that. On some days I feel like unable to circle that square, unable to decide like what is like worth most thing to do. And then sometimes it really takes stepping back to realize all of these dominoes have already been lined up and they were pushed over a while ago, and there aren't really like a response even to mitigate is kind of an illusion. There can be short-term gains, but like long-term gains I think are actually best addressed by building resilience, by building the capacity for survival, for thriving. Like I guess on my most, I don't even want to say pessimistic days, because in some ways it feels the most hopeful that I get is this like lifeboat strategy. Like if humanity is going to experience some version, some slow burn of civilization collapse, and there's going to be huge fracturing and huge tension and massive amounts of death and even more suffering. And in that kind of like long version crises, if there are little pockets of, meaningful, intentional, autonomous human life, like that's a good thing. And that's kind of the only sort of narrow way through into a much longer future that I see. So not to get too philosophical with it, but I guess that would be my ad lib ethical answer to the question, how do I in this moment accept the fact that like large amounts of humanity, both close to me geographically and far away from me and maybe displaced by a generation or two, are going to experience death, and I'm sort of like resigning myself to that. I guess it's because it's already happened, and now we have a much messier situation to like really zoom in on and make the best of.
Yeah, I guess I would just add, I think that it's a bit of a false dichotomy in that, I mean, our workshop in particular was not making the case that we should just accept what's happening. It was just basically more of a presentation on where things are at and where they're likely to go. And as part of that, I mean, we don't actually think that these mitigation steps are actually really occurring. And I think that this idea of wanting to kind of be part of this broader global movement that's gonna mitigate this stuff is actually what has been causing us to like not look at things seriously and not actually take the steps that we need to in order to be more prepared for what is looking like it's more it's imminent, right? So like all of this stuff, all of the efforts of social movements that are in a broad like umbrella of like environmentalist is pushing towards like sort of a greener kind of future or more sustainable development, which is just so at odds with like what is actually happening now with like this giant push towards data centers and a massive increase not just fossil fuels, but like all sorts of energy inputs to kind of try to generate this and conjure up this genie that's going to like solve the problem, right? And it's just sort of this kind of collective delusion that I think we were more just saying it's important for us to kind of break from this type of thinking and sort of shift our perspective. But that's also not to say that you just give up. I think that within that framework, there's a lot of room for fighting against the the projects that are actually contributing materially to climate devastation, not only just in terms of carbon emissions, which is kind of where that's sort of like the blinders that go around. A lot of the mainstream discourse around this is just like focuses just on carbon emissions, but also just the destruction of local water tables, like the destruction of like the deforestation of particular areas. Like if you actually start to look at defending a particular bioregion, it opens up. It not only does it actually help maintain like the viability and like these sort of territories as places where people can live, but it also does mitigate the thing that the mainstream environmentalist movement actually is claiming to be doing, right? It's actually a better strategy for that as well. So we didn't really go into it as much in our workshop, but that was also just something that I think has come up in discussions we've had. So we're not total climate nihilists. We're just climate realists.
I guess now I would just like to ask you like how you did the research for this project, what kinds of sources you used, and how that process worked for the three of you.
The government of Canada produces very usable, user-friendly like databases, and we got a lot of our information from either municipal or federal sources, mostly because again, a lot of these predictions come down to like a family of climate models that are run, I guess, on like supercomputers in Europe or something, and they're producing, like, they take local data, plug it into these like very large algorithms, and then they sort of like spit out predictions for the next, however many decades or coming 100 years or something. And these are models that most of the world and most of the scientific community is like unified on using. So then when we go to the government of Canada, there's like, again, not to say it was all from the government, so like this is kind of our baseline for some of this like more raw data. They're using pretty mainstream sources, and this allowed us to, especially for the next 25 years, paint a pretty moderate picture of what we're looking at. These climate models and this data is often broken up into like high and low carbon scenarios, and we kind of ran like middle of the road for both of our local and global forecasting. The truth is, like, as of today, we are on track for a high carbon scenario. We are on track for things to be kind of in the more extreme version of what we're looking at. So this is information, this is data, this is research that we did that not only is like, pretty accessible, but also it's the same information that the states have access to. And it's the same information that like policymakers and GOP, like everyone kind of has access to the same information. We're just like all drawing very different conclusions about it. I guess another source that I'll talk a lot less about is like think tank papers were kind of a funny like contribution, like whether or not they're military or policy advisory or like migration or like whatever it is. A lot of like international think tanks will like write these reports. They're all like PDFs online, and they're the ones that get like handed to like government officials or like military generals or something like that, people who are in a position to be making decisions. And again, you can tell when you're going through a lot of this, the space between like raw data and then the conclusions they come to. It seems like, if you read a paper that was from some sort of like security think tank, their proposals were often give more power to security and like make like prepare the nation for a military takeover and transition in this hard time. And like everyone's kind of pushing their own thing in the same way that I guess we are, like we're pushing an anarchist line from this otherwise very neutral information.
So just in terms of one of like, I will say, I think the research for each section varied and depended on what the topic was that we were covering. For one of the topics I did looking at like the industry, energy, and extraction. And so one of the things I did for that was actually just read the reports for what the actual plans are from both like on a global basis and then also like the national plan. And it was, I mean, they're boring stuff to read, but also just like really amazing to see how fantastical and how much they distort themselves in order to like actually try to shoehorn themselves into this zero carbon model. And if people actually read that, particularly those who are moderately equipped with the data and an awareness of how the world works, I mean, it's very clear that there's no chance that they're actually going to meet any of these emissions targets or any of these scenarios, and even that they actually just make up all sorts of technology that it just seems ridiculous, and it's almost as though they just expect that nobody's going to read these things. So just digging in and actually reading a bunch of these different reports is quite enlightening in and of itself. It seems as though the Canadian state is primarily guided towards the opportunities, the economic opportunities that are going to be opened up by climate change. So, I mean, I think that a large part of the Canadian state and military planners right now are focused on the opening up of new trade routes in the Arctic and what it means to actually defend those like trade routes by building new military bases and stuff like that. I don't think that, I mean, there are definitely we read some pieces from military strategists from Australia that were actually looking more at to like the prospect of social unrest and kind of civilizational collapse. And yeah, as was mentioned, I mean, they do kind of just tend to point to solutions such as like, put the intelligence networks in charge of the government or something like that, right? And I mean, I'm sure that those types of contingency plans probably exist to some extent in Canada, but we didn't come across any of them. The main things were basically, what are the economic opportunities for government investment in carbon capture and technologies and stuff like that, or like the investment opportunities from increased demand for critical minerals and stuff like that. That really seems to be where their head's at around a lot of this stuff.
And then I guess the follow-up to my question about the research is like, is this replicable? Like if someone's in a very different region in Canada or elsewhere, can they do a similar project where they could sort of model what their bioregion might look like and what people might have to face if they're not in Southern Ontario? And if so, like where would one start to do that?
I would start with the Canadian, I think it's called the Canadian Climate Atlas or maybe the Canada Climate Atlas. And that's a very user-friendly interactive map of the whole country and has lots of different layers. That's going to include a lot of like more annual seasonal temperature type changes, precipitation, that sort of thing. And then if you wanted to paint a picture of like your water table and how that might change, your biodiversity and how that might change, like that's going to be more municipal level research, which again is like libraries. Like I don't want to overcomplicate it. We didn't take super long, and I don't think any of us really struggled too much to find sources. So the very simple answer to your question is an overwhelming yes. This is very replicable.
And yeah, I think that people all around the world will come to very different conclusions based on whatever region they're living in. But the means of political inquiry or research and everything like that is definitely doable. I think it makes sense to get a small group of people together and figure out what sort of region you want to look at and what, and then just break it down and go from there. And it is the process of actually putting all the information together is and discussing it as a group is definitely worthwhile.
What plans do you folks have for this project? Like, is there further research to be done? Are you going to tour the workshop? Are you going to do anything else with it? Or what's next?
The short answer to your question is there aren't many more plans. I think we've already kind of carried this farther than we intended to. Not to say that it went in a bad direction so much as it was originally just supposed to be So we can like look at our friends in the eyes and be like, hey, we're worried about this. We want you to be worried about this, and then we want to start like making decisions together about it. So to that end, there's not that much more to do. A thought that I've had recently is that in a local way, continuing to digest new data, more news, like there's continuing to broaden the horizons of like what kinds of considerations or what kind of pieces of information get considered feels important. And I don't know if that's like a blog or like a Mastodon account or something like that, but if you establish yourself from a place of understanding, like maybe we have, and then in 5 years we're gonna have to update all this understanding anyway, so there's like an ongoing kind of like continuing to be educated dimension that is interesting, and I don't know exactly how to solve that, but that seems like a worthwhile pursuit. And then another angle is taking some of this more like speculative stuff and trying to also broaden the horizons of like the systems analysis of this whole thing. Something that's been interesting to us has been systems theory and like thinking in, I don't know, causality, but like along long chains of interrelated factors. But then also trying to map this onto other crises, right? Like outside of climate change, perhaps some folks would be familiar with other sort of like ways of looking at the world, geologically, ecologically. The planetary boundaries comes to mind. There are other crises outside of just emissions and greenhouse gases that are going to like materially affect the planet, and then you can map this onto, in a rather complicated way, like other crises. So that also remains to be explored.
Yeah, I think it might be worthwhile for us to have the workshop in a some sort of a form that's easier to reproduce, just in case we're asked to do it. I mean, we were surprised. I mean, I think a little bit by the feedback, and I mean, it was very clear that there was a hunger for this sort of conversation. So I could definitely see us doing the workshop in other locations, but we don't currently have any plans to go on tour or anything with it.
Okay. My last question, as always, is I guess for each of you, what is one thing that I didn't ask you about that you really wanted me to ask you about tonight?
One thing that our third comrade, who's not here, likes to close the workshop with is when talking to friends and comrades here in Southern Ontario, pointing to the Great Northern Clay Belt as an area of mild interest. It feels clear, and I hope it would feel clear. Any move towards whether that's like survival or resilience or human thriving is going to be almost like fractally centered around access to land, and whether that's however that's acquired, like that's up to the project itself. But accessing land has got to be a part of kind of any sort of project or relationship that like takes this into consideration, whether that's like people in urban centers developing relationships with people more rurally or something like that. But our friend wanted to point out that the Great Northern Clay Belt is an area where A, land is very affordable, B, it's one of the few little pockets of like agriculturally viable land in Northern Ontario. It's very underdeveloped. It's also like quite protected, or so far has been quite protected from forest fires. And yeah, it's very underpopulated. There's just a lot of potential there for someone who's like looking to build resilience and also community, and keep in mind like that any effort to endure and exist and persist and resist through climate change is still a social project. It's not like all about running into the woods to be by yourself and escape. It's about, I guess, taking care of yourself individually, but also trying to like gain as much power and as much resources with which you can like share and help other people as well.
I think that one of the other things that is important to keep in mind when discussing these sort of issues is obviously the colonial nature of the Canadian state, and that was something that definitely came up in some of our discussions about like when we're talking about settling different areas and like where is where is like territory that's like going to be up for grabs or whatever, and then even also just talking about the impacts and the ethical implications of massive migration and what that's going to do to the existing colonial dynamics in Canada is something that I think is a very important thing to be discussing, and then also just kind of like what sorts of relationships that we're actually building and what sort of alliances we're and like networks of solidarity we're building as we're kind of doing our preparation and sort of looking to put ourselves in a more advantageous position to survive the crisis that's coming forward. I think that's something that is important for people living in this part of the world to keep in mind always when we're talking about particularly struggles that involve and center around land and access to land.
Welcome to Propaganda by the Seed, a podcast about plants and the nerds that love them. We alternate between hour-long interview episodes that usually focus on a single species or crop, and shorter episodes that focus on topics related to plants like grafting, composting, and the rest. You can find Propaganda by the Seed on the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts at propagandabytheseed.com or most podcast platforms. I'll see you deep in the weeds.
Anarchists and other revolutionaries on the left have been paying attention to the revolution in northeast Syria for a long time now. Whether it's cheering on the Kurdish-led militias in the battle against ISIS, or taking notes on the structures of the neighborhood communes created after Assad was pushed out of the region, those fighting for a brighter future in the US and Canada have looked to Rojava for inspiration. The women's revolution in particular has drawn attention, with its all-women army and its governance structure that guarantees 50% of those in leadership roles are women. These days, the women's revolution in Rojava is at a turning point. In early 2025, the Kurdish-led movement in northeast Syria grappled with insurgent ISIS cells, a new government in Damascus, a massacre of Alawites on the coast, and the proclamation of a new era of the Kurdish freedom struggle from ideological leader Abdullah Öcalan. As Syrian refugees returned to a country free of Assad's control, a journalist from Canada made her way to the autonomous region to talk to activists, soldiers, veterans, and regional leaders about the shifting terrain and the challenges facing women on the ground. I was a part of that delegation that happened in March 2025, and you can hear directly from the women I interviewed in a new podcast series called After the Fall, Dispatches from the Women's Revolution in Northeast Syria. The 5-episode miniseries is an essential snapshot for understanding Kurdish and Syrian politics as we enter 2026. Check it out at afterthefallpod.libsyn.com or wherever you get your podcasts.